The Civil Wars by Julius Caesar. Translated by Rex Warner. Book 1, 50 B.C. The Senate refuses to compromise. My letter was delivered to the consuls, but it was a difficult matter to get permission for it to be read aloud in front of the Senate. Indeed, permission was only granted after the most vigorous agitation on the part of the people's tribunes. As for having a regular debate on the contents of the letter, it was found impossible to secure this concession at all. Instead, the consuls proceeded to bring in a motion on the political situation in general. The consul, Lucius Lentulus, addressed the Senate in a provocative manner. He assured them that he would play his full part in the defense of the Republic if the senators themselves would only show daring and resolution in the expression of their opinions. If, on the other hand, he said, as has happened on previous occasions, you are going to let your thoughts turn towards Caesar and the prospects of making yourselves popular in that direction, then I, Lentulus, am going to make my own decisions without reference to you. I, too, can, if I like, make myself safe by accepting Caesar's favor and Caesar's friendship. Scipio then made a speech to the same effect. Pompey, he said, was prepared to play his part in the defense of the Republic, so long as the Senate would follow his lead. If, however, the Senate showed weakness and hesitation now, though they might beg for his help in the future, they would beg for it in vain. As the meeting of the Senate was being held in Rome, and as Pompey was near the city at the time, it was considered that this speech of Scipio's had been dictated to him by Pompey himself. There were a few senators who expressed more moderate views. Marcus Marcellus, for example, who made a speech in which he suggested that this debate should not be held at all until recruiting had been carried out all over Italy, and until armies had been mobilized. There would then be, he said, a force to fall back upon, and it would be perfectly safe for the Senate to vote exactly as it wished to vote. Then there was Marcus Callidius, who proposed that in order that there should be no reason for a recourse to arms, Pompey should leave Italy and go to his provinces. Caesar, he said, has had 2 legions taken away from him by Pompey, and is now apprehensive because of the impression that Pompey is holding these legions in reserve, and keeping them near Rome with the idea of using them against him. Marcus Rufus also made a speech very much in the same terms as that of Callidius. All these speakers were vigorously attacked by the consul Lucius Lentulus in the most violent language. Lentulus absolutely refused to allow any discussion of the proposal of Callidius, and Marcellus, thoroughly scared by the language which was being used, withdrew his own proposal. So, as a result of the consul's angry words, of the terror caused by an army actually on the spot, and of the threats of Pompey's friends, the Senate adopted the proposal of Scipio, the majority of the senators voting under force and pressure and against their wills. Scipio's proposal was that Caesar should disband his army before a fixed date, and that if he failed to do so, he should be considered a public enemy. At this point the people's tribunes, Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, interposed their veto. Immediately the Senate was required to discuss whether this veto should be regarded as valid or not, a weighty and serious discussion. And the more bitter and savage a speech was, the more it was cheered by my enemies. The meeting of the Senate ended in the evening, and all senators were then invited to visit Pompey outside the city. Pompey offered his congratulations to those who had shown themselves ready for action, and encouraged them to preserve the same spirit in the future. He spoke sharply to the more lukewarm members and urged them to change their attitude. And now numbers of reserves from the armies which had served under Pompey in the past were called up, and offered the prospects of prize money and promotion. Also, many men from the 2 legions which I had handed over to him were brought to Rome. The city, even the part of the forum set aside for public business, was full of officers, centurions, and reserves. Pressure was brought to bear on all who were friends of the consuls, and all who were supporters of Pompey, or of my old enemies, to attend meetings of the Senate, and so vocal a crowd had the effect of terrifying the weaker spirits, and forcing their own views on those whose minds were not made up. Thus the majority were deprived of their right of coming to a free and independent decision. The censor, Lucius Piso, supported by the praetor, Lucius Roscius, undertook to go and give me a personal account of the situation. They asked for 6 days in order to do this. Other proposals also were made for sending a deputation to me to explain what the feelings of the Senate were. Every one of these speakers and every one of these proposals were attacked and opposed in speeches made by the consul, by Scipio, and by Cato. Cato was activated by his long hatred of me, and by his bitter feelings at having failed in the elections. The behavior of Lentulus can be explained by the fact that he had enormous debts, and was looking forward to the command of an army and of provinces, and to the bribes he would acquire for bestowing regal titles on native rulers. He boasted among his friends that he was going to become another Sulla, with supreme power in his hands. Scipio, too, was motivated by the expectation of a province and of armies which, since he was Pompey's father-in-law, he thought he ought to share with him. Other motives can be found in the fact that he was frightened of prosecution, that he had a violent, ostentatious character himself, and was led on by the flattery of men of like character, who at this time had great influence both in politics and in the law courts. As to Pompey, he had been pushed into action by my enemies, and also by his own wish that no one should be placed on the same level as himself. He had entirely broken off his old friendship with me, and had become friends again with those who had been enemies of us both, most of whom he personally had turned against me during the time that he was my son-in-law. He was also concerned about the discredit he had brought on himself by keeping back the 2 legions to serve his power and supremacy, instead of allowing them to go to Asia and Syria. Therefore, Pompey was eager to have things settled by force of arms. So everything was done hurriedly, and everything in a disorderly manner. My friends were not given the time necessary to inform me of the situation. The people's tribunes were not granted an opportunity to protest against the danger with which they were being threatened, nor were they permitted to exercise the right of veto which Lucius Sulla had left them. They had only 7 days in which to think about their own safety, whereas, in the past, the most revolutionary tribunes had always been able to count upon at least 8 months of office before fearing any personal danger that might proceed from their activities. Now the government fell back on the famous formula known as the final decree of the Senate, a decree which previously had never been passed except on occasions when criminal elements had got completely out of hand, when Rome itself was, one might say, on fire, and no one knew where to turn for safety. The terms of the decree are these: the consuls, the praetors, the tribunes, and all who have held the office of consul and are near the city are to take the appropriate measures for the security of the state. It was on January the 7th that these resolutions were officially recorded by a decree of the Senate. So, leaving aside the 2 days which were occupied with elections, and the first 5 days of Lentulus's consulship on which meetings of the Senate could be held, decrees of the most savage and of the most insulting kind were passed, depriving me of my command, and the tribunes of their rights and dignity. The tribunes immediately fled from Rome, and joined me at Ravenna, where I was waiting to receive a reply to my own very moderate demands, and hoping that a certain sense of fairness might be shown, so that everything could end peacefully. On the following days, the Senate held its meetings outside Rome. Pompey acted just as he had indicated that he would when Scipio had, as it were, spoken for him. He praised the senators for the strong and resolute line which they had adopted. In giving an account of the forces available to him, he stated that he had 10 legions ready for action, and furthermore that he knew for a certainty that I was unpopular with my own troops. They would neither protect me nor follow me into battle. The Senate then proceeded immediately to the discussion of further business. It was proposed that recruiting should be organized all over Italy, that Faustus Sulla should be sent at once to Mauritania, that money should be granted to Pompey from the treasury. It was also proposed that King Juba should be given the titles of ally and friend, but Marcellus refused to countenance this for the time being. The tribune Philippus vetoed the proposal about Faustus, but the other proposals were carried and officially recorded. Provinces, 2 that should have gone to ex-consuls and others that should have gone to ex-praetors, were given by decree to private individuals without the proper qualifications. Scipio was to have Syria, and Lucius Domitius was to have Gaul. The allotment was privately rigged in such a way that Philippus and Cotta were passed over, their names not being included among the lots which were drawn. Praetors were sent out to the other provinces, nor did they wait, as had been the practice in previous years, for a bill to be brought before the people confirming them in their commands. Instead, they threw on their scarlet cloaks of office, carried out the usual religious ceremonies, and left the city. And, a thing which had never before happened in history, both consuls also left Rome. Contrary to all tradition and precedent, people with no official rank were to be seen in Rome and in the capital itself, attended by lictors. All over Italy, men were being called up and arms were being requisitioned. Municipalities were forced to hand over sums of money. Temple treasures were seized and taken away. The rights of men and the laws of God were disregarded. It was a state of chaos. Caesar invades Italy. When I was informed of what was happening, I called my soldiers together and addressed them. I gave them examples of how my enemies had been constantly attacking me throughout my life, and I pointed out with sorrow that it was these same enemies who had been working on the mind of Pompey and leading him astray. They had done this by making Pompey jealous of me and anxious to detract from the glory which I had won, although I myself had always been on Pompey's side and had helped him to enjoy his honors and the high position in which he was held. I went on to complain that a new precedent was being introduced in Roman politics. The tribune's right of veto was now being regarded as a crime, and was being suppressed by force. Sulla, I pointed out, had deprived the tribunes of nearly all of their powers, but had still allowed them to retain the right of veto. Pompey, who in the past had got the credit for having given back to the tribunes the rights which they had lost, had now taken away from them even the rights which they had then. With regard to the decree of the Senate that the government should take its own measures for the security of the state, a formula which amounted to putting the Roman people under martial law, I pointed out that this decree had never been passed except in situations when dangerous legislation was being proposed, when the tribunes had resorted to violence, and when there had been a popular revolution involving the seizure of temples and of strategic points in Rome. These things, I explained, had happened in the past, and Saturninus and the Gracchi had died because of them. But at the present moment nothing of the sort had taken place at all, or had even been contemplated. Finally, I reminded my audience that for 9 years now they had been under my command, and had served the state with the best of fortune. They had won battle after battle, and had brought order into the whole of Gaul and Germany. Would they now not defend their general from his enemies, and safeguard for him the fame and glory which he had won? The men of the 13th Legion, which I had called up at the beginning of the emergency, the other legions had not yet joined me, shouted out that they were ready to protect their general and the people's tribunes from injury and injustice. So, after having discovered how the soldiers felt, I set out with this one legion for Rimini, where I met the tribunes who had fled to me. I sent instructions to the other legions to leave their winter quarters and march after me. At Rimini I was visited by young Lucius Caesar, whose father was on my staff. After the usual courtesies had been exchanged, the young man explained the real reason for his visit. He had come to me with a personal message from Pompey. The message was as follows. Pompey did not want me to think badly of him for what he had done, and wished me to understand that he was acting for the sake of the state, and not with a view to undermining and belittling me. It had always been his view that the interests of the state should be considered as more important than any private feelings he might have for individuals. I, too, in his opinion, owed it to myself to make some sacrifices to the public interest. I should adopt a calmer and less angry attitude. I should not allow my hostility toward my enemies to carry me to the point where, in the hope of doing them harm, I was actually doing an injury to the state. This, with a few other remarks of the same kind, and with some words spoken in excuse of Pompey, was the substance of the message. The praetor Roscius also had an interview with me in which he said much the same things in practically the same language, making it clear that Pompey himself had instructed him what to say. Certainly there was nothing in all this which could have the effect of putting right what had been done wrong. Nevertheless, I had at least found people of the right sort to carry back to Pompey an account of what my own wishes were. I therefore spoke to them both, and said that, since they had brought Pompey's message to me, I hoped they would not object to telling Pompey in reply what I myself demanded. Thus, by taking a little trouble, they might be able to settle a great dispute, and free the whole of Italy from fear. I have always, I said, put the good name and honor of the state first, and have regarded them as more valuable than life itself. What distressed me was to find that my enemies, in the most insulting manner, were taking from me a privilege that had been granted to me by the Roman people. I was being deprived of 6 months of my command, and was being dragged back to Rome, although the people had ratified the proposal that I should be allowed to stand for the consulship at the next elections without being personally present. Nevertheless, for the sake of the state, I accepted this infringement of my rights and attack upon my honor with a good grace. But when I sent a letter to the Senate proposing that both sides should disband their armies, I failed even to gain this point. Troops are being raised all over Italy, 2 legions, stolen from me on the pretext that they were to be used against Parthia, are still in the country. The whole state is under arms. How can all this be explained except on the assumption that there is a plan to destroy me? Yet for the sake of the state I am still prepared to make any concession and to put up with anything. I propose that Pompey should go to his provinces, that both of us should disband our armies, and that everyone in Italy should return to civilian life, that the state should be freed from fear, that the holding of free elections and the general control of affairs should be handed over to the Senate and the Roman people. In order that this should be done with as little trouble as possible, and on fixed terms which should be ratified by oath, I propose that either Pompey should come nearer to me, or else should allow me to come nearer to him. A conference between the 2 of us would have the effect of settling all difficulties. Roscius undertook to deliver this message, and went with Lucius Caesar to Capua, where he found the consuls and Pompey. He informed them of my demands, and after discussing the matter, they gave him their reply in the form of a written message. This was to the following effect. I was to return to Gaul, evacuate Rimini, and disband my forces. If I did so, Pompey should go to his Spanish provinces. Meanwhile, until they received a guarantee that I would do as I had promised, the consuls and Pompey would continue to raise troops. These terms were unfair. It was unfair of Pompey to demand that I should retire to Gaul, while he kept both his provinces and the legions that did not belong to him. To want me to disband my troops while he himself continued to recruit new forces. To promise to go to his province, but give no definite date for when he would do so. Thus, even if he stayed in Italy until my consulship was over, he could not be considered guilty of having broken his word. Finally, what showed that there was very little hope of peace was the fact that Pompey allowed no time for a conference and made no suggestion that he should come near me personally. I therefore sent Mark Antony from Rimini to Arezzo with 5 cohorts. I myself, with 2 cohorts, stayed at Rimini and raised troops there. I occupied Pesaro, Fano, and Ancona, sending 1 cohort to each place. I was now informed that the praetor, Thermus, was holding Gubbio with 5 cohorts, and was fortifying the town, but it appeared that the townspeople themselves were very much on my side. I therefore sent Curio to Gubbio with the 3 cohorts which he had at Pesaro and Rimini. Thermus, hearing of Curio's approach and feeling no confidence in the goodwill of the inhabitants of the place, withdrew his cohorts and took to flight. His troops deserted him on the march and scattered to their homes, while Curio, to the great delight of everyone, recovered Gubbio for us. The news of these events made me feel confident that I had the goodwill of the people in the towns, and so I withdrew the cohorts of the 13th Legion from their garrison duties and marched on Osimo. This place was held by Publius Attius Varus, who had brought his cohorts inside the town and, with the aid of senators who were being sent around the countryside, was organizing recruiting throughout Picenum. When it was known that I was drawing near, the town council of Osimo went to Attius Varus in a body, and told him that they were not free to act as they wished. In fact, neither they nor their fellow townsmen could bear the thought of shutting out from their town a man like Gaius Caesar, who held an official command, and who, by his great exploits, had so very much earned the gratitude of his country. They therefore advised Varus to think of what the future might bring, and of the danger in which he stood himself. This speech had a very disturbing effect on Varus. He withdrew the garrison, which he had brought into the town, and took to flight. A few of my men from the leading detachments went after him and forced him to halt. In the fighting that followed, Varus was deserted by his men. Some of them scattered to their homes, the rest came over to me. Among these was Lucius Pupius, a senior centurion who had previously held the same rank in the army of Gnaeus Pompey. He was now brought to me as a prisoner. I congratulated Varus's men on their behavior and allowed Pupius to go free. I also thanked the people of Osimo for their help and promised to remember what they had done. At Rome, the news of these actions caused a sudden outbreak of panic. The consul Lentulus, for example, had gone to open the treasury to take money out of it for Pompey, in accordance with a decree of the Senate, but he had only got as far as opening the inner part of the treasury when he turned around and fled from the city. This was because it had been incorrectly reported that I was on the point of arriving, and that my cavalry were already in sight. Lentulus's colleague, Marcellus, and most of the other magistrates followed him. Pompey had left Rome on the previous day and had gone to join the legions which he had taken from me and put into different winter camps in Apulia. There was now no further calling up of men for the army in the area of Rome. Indeed, the general view was that there was no safety anywhere north of Capua. It was at Capua that they pulled themselves together and recovered their confidence. They began to raise troops from the colonists who had been settled there under the Julian law. There were also the gladiators whom I kept at Capua in a training establishment, and Lentulus, after bringing these men into the forum, offered them their freedom, gave them horses, and ordered them to follow him. Later, however, on the advice of his friends, since this action of his was generally disapproved of, he distributed these gladiators, for the sake of security, among the households of people whom he knew in the citizen body of Capua. Meanwhile, I had left Asimo and overrun the whole of Picenum. Everywhere in these parts the prefectures gave me the warmest possible welcome, and did all they could to help supply the army. A deputation actually came to me from Cingulo, a town which had been founded and built by Labienus at his own expense. The deputation stated that they were most anxious to do whatever I commanded. I asked for soldiers, and they sent them. By this time I was joined by the 12th Legion, so it was with 2 legions that I set out for Ascoli in Picenum. This town was held by Lentulus Spentha with 10 cohorts. As soon as he heard of my arrival, he fled from the town, attempting to take his cohorts with him. But a great number of his men deserted. Abandoned by them on the march, and with only a few followers, he met with Vibullius Rufus, who had been sent by Pompey into Picenum in order to keep up the morale of the inhabitants. After receiving an account from Spentha of how things actually were going in Picenum, Vibullius took over the troops and let Spentha himself go on his way. He also got together from the neighbourhood all the cohorts which he could that had been raised by Pompey's recruiting agents. Lucilius Hirrus, in full flight from Camarino with the 6 cohorts he had there as a garrison, was among those who were brought in this way. Altogether, Vibullius got together a force of 13 cohorts. With these he went by forced marches to join Domitius Ahenobarbus at Corfinium, and reported to him that I was approaching with 2 legions. Domitius had by his own efforts brought up from Alba about 20 cohorts, having recruited the troops from the neighbouring districts of the Marsi and the Peligni. Capture of Corfinium. After we had taken Fermo and driven Lentulus out of Ascoli, I ordered that the soldiers who had deserted Lentulus should be rounded up, and that a program of recruiting should begin. I stayed there for 1 day, which was spent in organizing supplies of food, and then marched on Corfinium. On my arrival I found 5 cohorts which had been sent out of the town by Domitius engaged in breaking down the bridge over the river, which was about 3 miles from the town. Fighting broke out between these cohorts and my advanced detachments. The soldiers of Domitius were quickly defeated and driven back into the town. I brought the legions across the river, halted outside the town, and pitched camp close to the wall. When he discovered what had happened, Domitius found some men who knew the country well, and promising them a large reward, sent them to Pompey in Apulia. They were to beg Pompey most urgently to come to his help, and to point out that with 2 armies operating against me in a mountainous district, I could easily be cut off from supplies. If, on the other hand, Pompey failed to come to his help, then he himself, with more than 30 cohorts, and a great number of senators and upper-class Romans, would find themselves in a very dangerous position. Meanwhile, Domitius encouraged his troops to resist, placed artillery on the walls, and gave everyone his particular duty to perform in the defence of the town. In a speech to the soldiers, he promised to give them land from his own estates, 4 acres to each man, with proportionately increased allowances for the centurions and reserves. Meanwhile, I was informed that the people of Sulmona, a town 7 miles from Corfinium, were anxious to give me their support, but were being prevented from doing so by Quintus Lucretius, a senator, and by Attius the Pelignian, who were holding the town with a garrison of 7 cohorts. I sent Mark Antony to Sulmona with 5 cohorts of the 13th Legion, and as soon as the people of the place saw our standards, they opened the gates, and came out all together, both townsmen and soldiers, to meet Antony and to express their pleasure at his arrival. Lucretius and Attius threw themselves down from the wall. Attius was brought to Antony and asked that he might be sent to me. Antony, on the same day on which he had set out, returned, bringing with him the cohorts and Attius. I incorporated these cohorts in my own army, and let Attius go free. In the course of the first days, while I was waiting for the rest of my forces to arrive, I organized the building of strong fortifications around the camp, and the bringing in of supplies of grain from the towns in the neighborhood. After 3 days, I was joined by the 8th Legion, together with 22 cohorts which had recently been raised in Gaul, and about 300 cavalry sent by the King of Noricum. On their arrival, I established a second camp on the other side of the town, and put Curio in command of it. On the following days, I began to invest the town with an earthwork and fortified posts. At about the time that this work was nearing completion, Domitius's messengers returned from Pompey. Domitius read the message which they brought, and then, concealing the real truth, announced in a general meeting that Pompey would soon be coming to their help. He therefore urged them to keep up their spirits and do all that was necessary for the defense of the town. Privately, however, in conversations with his friends, he was planning how he could manage to run away. It was now observed that the way he looked was scarcely consistent with the speech he had made, that there was a kind of uneasy hurry and timidity in his actions, which had not been noticeable on the previous days, and that, contrary to his usual habit, he was spending a lot of time in secret talk with his friends, and avoiding general discussions at which large numbers were present. It became impossible for the deception and dissimulation to be kept up any longer. In fact, Pompey had written back to say that he had no intention of endangering his whole position, and that it was not by his advice or with his consent that Domitius had brought his army into the town of Corfinium. Finally, if at all possible, he recommended Domitius to come to him with all his forces. This plan, however, was now becoming an impossibility because of my blockade and investment of the town. When it became generally known what Domitius's real intentions were, the soldiers at Corfinium gathered together by themselves in the early evening and discussed matters under the guidance of officers, centurions, and reliable men of other ranks. The gist of what they said was this: "We are being besieged by Caesar. His system of fortifications is almost completed. We have remained loyal to our leader, Domitius, because we trusted him and relied upon him. But he has now abandoned all of us and is planning to run away himself. We therefore ought to think about our own safety." At first the Marsi began to object to these conclusions, and seized what appeared to be the best fortified part of the town. Indeed, such was the difference between the two factions that there was a move toward fighting the matter out by force of arms. Soon, however, after messengers had been sent to and fro between the two sides, the Marsi learned what they had not known before, that Domitius was planning to run away. They were now all of the same opinion. They forced Domitius out into the open, surrounded him, and kept him under guard. They then sent some of their own men on a deputation to me to say that they were prepared to open the gates, to obey my orders, and to hand over Lucius Domitius alive. With these facts before me, I realized clearly enough how important it was to get possession of the town and incorporate the cohorts there into my own army at the earliest possible moment. There was always a risk that they might change their minds, either because of promised rewards, or renewed confidence, or false news, since, as I knew, it very often happens in war that decisive events proceed from some very small tipping of the scale. But I was afraid that the town might be sacked and looted in the disorder that would result from my troops entering it by night. And so, after praising the action of those who had come to me, I sent them back into the town, and ordered that the gates and walls should be carefully guarded. I personally saw to the posting of my own men along the lines of fortifications which we had been building. They were posted not as on previous days, in a series of patrols with a fixed space of ground between each, but in a continuous line of sentries and outposts, so that each man was in touch with the man on each side of him, without a gap anywhere in the whole circle of the fortifications. I sent officers around with instructions that they must not only be on their guard against a general attempt at breaking out, but must also keep their eyes open for individuals who might attempt to slip through on their own. And in fact their spirit was so keen and alert that not a man among them took any rest on that night. There was a tremendous sense of something very important being about to take place. Everyone was thinking or imagining what was going on in one direction or another, what was happening to the Corfinians themselves, what was happening to Domitius and to Lentulus and the others. At about 5 in the morning, Lentulus Spenther, speaking from the wall, got into touch with our sentries and patrols. He said that he would like to have an interview with me if he were allowed to do so. This permission was granted, and he was escorted out of the town by some of Domitius's soldiers, who did not leave him until they had brought him actually into my presence. He then began to plead for his safety, begging and praying me to spare him. He reminded me of our old friendship and of the various kindnesses which I had done him. These, in fact, had been considerable. It was owing to me that Lentulus had been appointed to the College of Pontiffs, and had received the province of Spain after his praetorship, and I had also helped him in his candidature for the consulship. Now I interrupted him in the middle of his speech. "I do not," I said, "leave my province with the intention of doing any harm. My aim was to defend myself from the insulting behavior of my enemies, to restore the tribunes, who on this issue had been driven out of the state, to their proper position, and to free both myself and the Roman people from the oppression of a small minority party." These words had an encouraging effect on Lentulus. He asked to be allowed to return to the town, saying that his own success in pleading for his safety would come as a great relief to the others, who were also hoping for mercy. Some of these, he said, were so terrified that they were actually contemplating suicide. So Lentulus was allowed to go back into the town, and did so. As soon as it was light, I ordered all senators and their sons, all officers and all members of the Roman gentry outside the Senate to be brought before me. There were 50 of them. Of senators there were Lucius Domitius, Publius Lentulus Spenther, Lucius Caecilius Rufus, Sextus Quintilius Varus, the quaestor, and Lucius Rubrius. There was also the son of Domitius, and many more young men, a large number of Roman gentlemen outside the senatorial order, and town councillors whom Domitius had brought in from the municipalities. These were all brought before me, and I shielded them from the angry and violent language of the troops. In a short speech I complained that there were among them some who, in return for very great acts of kindness on my part, had shown me no gratitude at all. I then allowed them all to go free. As for the 6 million sesterces which had been brought by Domitius to Corfinium, placed in the public treasury, and then given back to him by the 4 magistrates of the town, I returned this money to Domitius. I wished it to be known that I could spare people's property just as well as I could spare their lives, although, in the case of this money, there was no doubt at all that it belonged to the state, and had been given to Domitius by Pompey for the payment of the troops. I ordered the soldiers of Domitius to take the military oath of loyalty to me. Then, on the same day, I moved camp and completed a full day's march. Altogether I had been 7 days at Corfinium, so, going through the country of the Marrucini, the Frentani, and the Larenates, I made my way into Apulia. Pompey retires from Italy. When Pompey received the news of what had happened at Corfinium, he left Luceria and went to Canossa, and from there to Brindisi. He gave orders that all the newly enrolled troops from every quarter should report to him at the latter town. He armed slaves and herdsmen and supplied them with horses, thus raising a force of about 300 cavalry. The praetor Lucius Manlius was in flight from Alba with 6 cohorts, and the praetor Rutilius Lupus from Terracina with 3. On catching sight of my cavalry, under the command of Vibius Curius, they deserted their praetor and went over to Curius, bringing their standards with them. So too, on other marches, various cohorts fell in with and joined either my main army or the cavalry. Caught in this way and brought to me was Numerius Magius of Cremona, Pompey's chief engineer. I released him and sent him to Pompey with a message. He was instructed to say that up to now no opportunity of holding a conference had been permitted. Now, however, I myself was on my way to Brindisi, and it was important for the state and the general welfare of everyone that I should meet Pompey personally. When we had been a long way away from each other, and terms of agreement had to be carried to and fro by other people, it was much harder to come to a satisfactory understanding. Now, however, we could meet face to face and discuss all conditions that were to be considered. After giving these instructions to Magius, I went on to Brindisi. I had with me 6 legions, 3 of which were veteran. The remainder had been recently conscripted and then brought up to their full strength on the march. I had sent the cohorts that had served under Domitius straight from Corfinium to Sicily. I found that the consuls, with a great part of the army, had left for Durazzo, while Pompey, with about 20 cohorts, was remaining at Brindisi. It was impossible to be sure why he was doing this. In holding Brindisi, he may have aimed at making it easier for him to control the whole Adriatic. He would, with bases both in the south of Italy and on the coast of Greece, be in a position to operate from both sides of the sea. On the other hand, he may simply have been short of shipping. Personally, I was afraid that he might think he had an obligation not to abandon Italy, so I decided to block the harbour and make Brindisi useless as a port. We built out walls filled with earth to form a dam from each side of the harbour entrance where it was at its narrowest. This was perfectly practicable because the water was shallow at these points. Farther out, however, in deeper water, where the dam would not hold together, I had double rafts fixed at the ends of the walls. The rafts were 30 feet square, and were held in position by anchors at each corner to prevent them from being shifted out of position by the waves. Once these were finished and put in the right place, we attached to them other rafts of the same size, covering them with earth and giving them a raised causeway so that there would be no difficulty in getting men into them quickly for purposes of defence. In front and on both sides the structure was protected with hurdles and screens, and on every 4th raft we built a tower 2 stories high to protect the rafts from enemy ships and attack by fire. As a countermeasure, Pompey fitted out some large merchant ships which he had captured in the harbour of Brindisi. He erected on these ships towers 3 stories high, and after equipping them with a number of catapults and long-range weapons of all kinds, he brought them close up to my dams, with the idea of destroying them by breaking through the line of rafts. So every day there was long-range fighting on both sides, with slings, arrows, and other missile weapons. Yet, with all these operations on hand, I still thought that no opportunity for making peace should be neglected. I was, in fact, extremely surprised that Magius had brought back no reply to the message which I had given him for Pompey, and I realized that these constant efforts of mine to reach an understanding were handicapping me both in action and in planning for the future. Nevertheless, I thought that on all accounts I ought to go on trying for peace, and with this end in view, I sent a member of my staff, Caninius Rebilus, to discuss the matter with Scribonius Libo, with whom he was on very friendly terms. Caninius was to urge Libo to use his good offices for making peace. He was to say that what I wanted most of all was to have an interview with Pompey. If this chance were given me, Caninius pointed out, I was very confident indeed that fair terms could be found for a cessation of hostilities on both sides, and much of the honor and credit for all this would go to Libo if, on his initiative and by his help, both sides did lay down their arms. After talking with Caninius, Libo went to see Pompey. In a little time he came back with the reply, which was that it was impossible to carry on any negotiations for a settlement because the consuls were not present. Having attempted so often and with such little success to come to an understanding, I now decided that the time had come to abandon these efforts and to give my attention to the war. About half the work of blockading the harbour had been completed. 9 days had been spent on it, when the ships which had transported the first part of the army to Durazzo, and had been sent back from there by the consuls, returned to Brindisi. As soon as they arrived, Pompey began to make his preparations for departure, either because he was alarmed by our operations, or because he had intended from the beginning to leave Italy. In order to prevent my troops from attacking and breaking into the town at the very moment he was leaving it, he barricaded the gates, built roadblocks across the lanes and passages, and dug trenches across the main streets. Inside these trenches he fixed stakes of wood, sharpened at the end, and concealed the trenches with a covering of light hurdles and earth. Huge pieces of timber, also sharpened at the ends, were placed in the ground at the approaches to the harbour to block up the 2 routes which led there. When all this was done, he ordered his soldiers to embark in silence. At intervals along the walls and in the towers, he posted light-armed troops from the reserves, archers and slingers. He planned to withdraw these at a given signal when all the rest had embarked, and left some oar-driven ships for them in a place that would be easy to reach. The people of Brindisi, angry at the ill treatment they had received from Pompey's soldiers, and at the arrogance shown to them by Pompey himself, were on my side. When they realized that Pompey was leaving, and while his men were fully occupied in hurrying to their stations, in every quarter of the town signs were made from the rooftops to show what was happening. As soon as I found this out, not wanting to let slip any opportunity for action, I ordered my men to fall in and to have scaling ladders ready. Pompey set sail at nightfall. The men posted as guards on the wall were recalled by the signal that had been agreed upon, and ran down to the ships by routes which they knew. My soldiers brought up their ladders and mounted the walls. Here they halted, as they were warned by the people of Brindisi, to avoid the hidden obstacles and ditches. Then, guided by the Brindisians, they made a long detour and reached the harbour, where they found 2 ships with troops on board which had fallen foul of the dam. These they captured, making use of light craft of various kinds for the purpose. In the hope of finishing the business off, I was very much inclined to get ships together, cross the sea, and go after Pompey before he could build up his strength with forces from abroad. To do this, however, would mean waiting and delaying for a long time, and I was afraid of this. Pompey had laid his hands on all the ships available, and so had deprived me of any immediate opportunity of pursuing him. I could only wait for ships to arrive from the more remote parts of Gaul, from Picenum, and from the Sicilian Straits, and owing to the time of the year, this operation seemed certain to be difficult and could not be done quickly. Meanwhile, there was a veteran army, and the 2 provinces of Spain, one of which was devoted to Pompey because of great benefits received from him in the past. I had no wish that in my absence this army and these provinces should grow stronger still, that extra forces and cavalry should be raised against me, and attempts made to invade Gaul and Italy. I therefore gave up for the time being the project of going after Pompey, and decided to set out for Spain, meanwhile giving orders to the officials of all municipal towns to find ships and have them brought to Brindisi. I sent 1 legion under Valerius to Sardinia, and 2 others to Sicily under the command of the propraetor Curio. Curio's orders were, after recovering Sicily, to take his army immediately across to Africa. At the time, Marcus Cotta was in command of Sardinia and Marcus Cato of Sicily. Tubero, according to the allotment of provincial posts, should have been in command of Africa. In the town of Cagliari, as soon as it was known that Valerius was on his way, even before he had left Italy, the people of their own accord ejected Cotta. Terrified because he realized that the rest of the province held the same views, Cotta fled from Sardinia to Africa. In Sicily, Cato was repairing old warships and requisitioning new ones from the cities. He was devoting great energy to these tasks. In Lucania and Calabria, his officers were calling up Roman citizens for military service, and he was making the Sicilian cities produce a fixed quota of cavalry and infantry. These measures of his were almost complete when he heard that Curio was approaching. He then held a public meeting in which he complained that he had been abandoned and betrayed by Gnaeus Pompey, who, though totally unprepared for it, had undertaken an unnecessary war, and, when questioned in the Senate by himself and the others, had maintained that he had in fact got everything required for warfare ready and in order. After making these complaints in a general meeting, Cato fled from his province. So Valerius and Curio, finding no established government in either Sardinia or Sicily, occupied these places with their armies. In Africa, Tubero found on his arrival that Attius Varus was holding the province. Varus, it will be recalled, had lost his cohorts at Osimo, and had immediately fled to Africa, where he had found the province without a governor, and had, on his own initiative, taken it over for himself. He had recruited troops and raised a force of 2 legions, being in a good position for doing this because he had governed Africa a few years previously after his praetorship, and so was familiar with the people and the country, and knew the province well. When Tubero with his ships arrived at Utica, Varus denied him access either to the harbour or to the town. He would not even allow him to land his son, who was suffering from an illness, but forced him to weigh anchor and leave the place. At Rome and at Marseille. After making the arrangements described above, I withdrew my troops and quartered them in the nearest towns, so as to rest them for the remainder of the season. I then set out for Rome. Here I called together the Senate and informed them of how disgracefully I had been treated by my enemies. I pointed out that I had not aimed at holding any unusual or extraordinary position. Instead, I had waited until I was legally qualified to stand for the consulship. I had, indeed, been content with the rights open to all citizens. In Pompey's own consulship, a law had been passed by the 10 tribunes giving me the right to stand for the consulship in my absence. My enemies had spoken against the proposal, and Cato had opposed it in the most violent language, and, according to his old tactics, had tried to prevent a vote by talking all day. But if Pompey had not approved of the measure, why had he allowed it to become law? If he had approved of it, why had he not allowed this act of kindness on the part of the people to become operative? I then called attention to the patience I had shown. It was I, of my own accord, who had proposed that the armies should be disbanded, and in making this proposal I was showing myself ready to sacrifice my own prestige and my own rights. I pointed out how bitterly intractable my enemies had been. They had demanded for themselves just what they refused to me, and preferred to bring about a state of chaos rather than give up their armies and military power. I commented on the injustice that had been done when the 2 legions were taken from me, and on the insolent brutality that had been shown in depriving the tribunes of their proper powers. I recalled to their minds the terms of peace which I had offered, the opportunities for discussion which I had begged for, and which had been refused. Because of all this, I urgently recommended that the senators should take up and share with me the responsibility of government. If, however, they were frightened and shrank from the task, I was not going to be a burden to them. I would run the state myself. What should be done, I suggested, was to send a deputation to Pompey to negotiate a settlement. And, I informed them, I was quite unmoved by that remark of Pompey's made recently in the Senate, to the effect that the mere sending of a deputation was a sign of fear and an acknowledgment of the superior authority of those to whom it was sent. That, I said, is a weak and wretched way of looking at things. As for me, just as I did my best to attain eminence as a man of action, so I am anxious to be ahead of others in showing respect for justice and fair play. The Senate approved the plan of sending a deputation, but no one could be found to serve on it, largely because everyone was too frightened for his own safety to take on such an appointment. For Pompey, when leaving Rome, had declared in the Senate that he would make no distinction between those senators who remained behind and those who were actually in my camp. So, what with the arguing and the excuses, matters dragged on for 3 days. My enemies also made use of the tribune Lucius Metellus to obstruct the business of the deputation, and, indeed, everything else that I proposed. I saw what his plan was, and, after having wasted several days, decided not to lose any more time. None of the things I had meant to do had been done, so I left Rome and went to Transalpine Gaul. Here I was informed that Verbullius Rufus, captured not long ago at Corfinium and given his liberty by me, had been sent by Pompey to Spain, and that Domitius too had set out for Marseille with the intention of occupying it. He had with him 7 rowing ships which he had requisitioned from their owners at Igilium and Cosanum, and had manned with his own slaves, ex-slaves, and tenants. I heard, too, that he had been preceded by some young nobles of Marseille, whom Pompey, just before he left Rome, had sent home to their own country, telling them to see to it that what I had been able to do for the place recently had not been allowed to make people forget the benefits which he had conferred on Marseille in the past. As the result of these instructions, the people of Marseille had closed their gates against me, and had called in help from the Albicci, a native tribe living in the mountains to the north, which had been for a long time in their sphere of influence. They had brought in grain from the surrounding country, and from all fortified areas. They had organized arms factories in the city, and were busy repairing the walls and gates and putting their fleet into a seaworthy condition. I asked 15 of the leading citizens of Marseille to come to see me, and tried to convince them that it was no duty of theirs to start a war. Instead of giving in to the wishes of a solitary individual, they ought, I said, to follow the lead given to them by the whole of Italy, and I added all the other arguments which seemed likely to make them see sense. After reporting back what I had said, they returned to me with their government's reply, which was as follows. We find that the Roman people is split into 2 parties. This is not our business, nor have we any power of jurisdiction to decide which side is in the right. The leaders of the parties are Gnaeus Pompey and Gaius Caesar, both officially recognized as benefactors of Marseille. Pompey gave us a grant of land in the country of the Volcae Aromici and of the Helvae, and you, Caesar, after you had conquered the Sullies, gave us control of them and increased our revenues. Then, since you are both equally our benefactors, we should, on our side, give an equal return to each of you. This can be done by remaining neutral and allowing neither side to have access to our city or to our harbours. In the middle of all this, Domitius arrived with his ships at Marseilles. He was not only received there, but was made governor of the city and commander-in-chief. On his instructions, they sent out their fleet, and, in a wide sweep, commandeered all the merchant ships they could find and brought them back to harbour. Those inadequately equipped were dismantled, and the bolts, timber, and rigging were used for the fitting out or repairing of other vessels. All grain found aboard was confiscated and stored in the public granaries. The rest of the cargoes, merchandise or provision, were sequestered for use in case of a siege. Realizing that I had been disgracefully treated, I brought up 3 legions against Marseilles. Work was begun on the towers and mantlets for an assault on the city, and I ordered 12 warships to be constructed at Arles. These were built and ready for service in 30 days from the time that the timber was first felled for them. When they reached Marseilles, I put Decimus Brutus in command of them, and entrusted the task of besieging the city to Gaius Trebonius.